Well, welcome everybody to this afternoon's panel, Seeds, the Connection Through Generations. We have a very distinguished and illustrious panel, and I thought we'd just take a minute and have each of them introduce themselves briefly. Let's start with Dr. Richard Ford at the end.
I'm Richard Ford at the end. No, I'm a retired a professor of anthropology and botany from the University of Michigan, and I live in Santa Fe.
I'm Louie Hena from Tisuki Pueblo, co-founder of the New Mexico Food and Seed Sovereignty Alliance.
I'm Lynda Prim. I'm a farmer and seed grower, former ethnobotanist, and I work for Native Seed Search. I'm the farm manager at their conservation farm in Patagonia, Arizona.
And my name's Scott Canning. I've been in public gardens for a long time, mostly in New York. I moved back to New Mexico after being away for 22 years and started working at the Santa Fe Botanic Garden as their director of horticulture and special projects in April.
And I'm Thomas Antonio, the moderator for this session, and I teach science at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So we're gonna try to be strict, even though we probably will run over because we've started late. But I have a timer here, so I thought we would just start with 10 minutes. You have each 10 minutes, and I would give you, at the end of 8, I will go like this, which means you've got 2 minutes left. So, who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Scott will go first.
Go.
Take it away, Scott.
Well, I just enjoyed a panel discussion with the two gentlemen to my right, and the title of that panel was, Does going local save traditional foods? Which begs the question, do traditional foods need to be saved? And I think I'm preaching to the choir. I think there's a general consensus that there's an endangered element to indigenous food and to a lot of our wild plants and our wild food sources. A great concern that our heirlooms and traditional foods are disappearing. And there are some well-intentioned attempts to conserve those foods. There are seed banks and even technology getting involved as far as doing seed storage. In general, these seed banks, they want to save as many plants as they can. But to keep those plants viable, you have to have land and grow those crops and gather the seed and then save them again. With some seed, especially small seeded plants in general, and dryland plants, the seeds are quite long-lived. But a lot of seed food plants that have large seeds, like squash and beans, they're less long-lived. So one of the techniques they use is cryogenic storage. So they try to cold store these seeds and then grow them out every 5 to 8 years so that they wouldn't have to have so much labor-intensive growing. They could grow them out every 5 or 10 years, save the seed, put them in cold storage, and in that way conserve those endangered seeds. But just like with every technology, there's unintended consequences. And what they found when they did that for just a couple of generations is that the seeds they thought they were saving were changing. The seeds that they were growing out were not identical to the crops they thought they were saving. And what they realized is that they were selecting seed that had long shelf life in cryogenic storage. So just saving them cold meant that the seeds that didn't store well in cold died, and the seeds that did store well lived, and that's what they were growing out. And in just a couple of generations, the seed was changing. And I think that speaks to the fact that the best way to save these seeds and the best way to conserve these crops is to save the cultures that grow them. There is no technological shortcut, and I think that's scary. But I think it's our cooperative work ahead of us to try to make sure that the cultures survive and that the foods are grown and that there's an interest in those crops. I think it's also a strong argument against GMO crops that's not discussed enough, is that if you're not able to gene splice and you run up against a crop disease, you have to look for resistance in the wild plants that are related or in one of the heirloom crops that are resistant. And if those are disappearing and are not able to be put into a hybridizing program, it's a problem. So if I think there's one way we can help is if we push back against GMO foods. They have a stake in making sure that genetic material doesn't disappear. It's a long shot, but it's one way we can try to conserve plants. Wild potatoes and wild tomatoes are at risk because of the threat to their habitat in South America and in Central America. And a couple of years ago, I was a victim. We had late blight, which wiped out almost the entire tomato crop from Florida up to New England. And of course, that begs the question, do you result in chemicals and fungicides, or you try to find resistant crops? So I think you need those wild sources and those indigenous crops to look at the ones that survived those epidemics and use them to breed plants that will save us. And another thing I think is missing from the conversation is that heirloom seeds aren't just these ancient things. We are creating them today. Just seed saving, which is so important, and so few gardeners do it. Even though I'm a vegetable gardener and I've just started saving seed, when you save seed, you're selecting the plants that thrived in your particular environment, with your particular soils, with your late frosts. And if you save the seeds of those crops, you can, in your lifetime, if it's an annual crop, grow 50 or 60 or even 80 generations of a crop, and you can have an amazing impact by saving seed from the things that you grow. And it's as easy as coin envelopes and just letting some things go to seed. Now, granted, there's limitations. I like to grow heirloom tomatoes, and I like to grow 27 varieties. And of course, they are promiscuous, and you can't save the seed if you're growing them all together, because the seed you save will all be hybrids and just crazy hybrids. But what you can do is, again, increase cooperation and have your neighbors, if you can get your neighbors to become gardeners, have them grow as far away as possible a couple of those tomatoes, and you grow a few and share the crop and bring the community into a solution. But the Brandywine tomato, for instance, as an example, is something that wasn't intentionally created. It was a crop that was selected in the Brandywine Valley to thrive in those conditions, and to be also a crop that those people liked, that were big and meaty and delicious. But you can, in your own garden today, create your own heirlooms and be part of the solution also.
Shall we just go right down the line in a minute?
Sure.
So I'm going to take a little different tact, since Scott has covered so much about why preserve genetic diversity. And I'm a storyteller and feel like we were given permission to tell stories in this session, the way it was advertised. So I came to, first of all, I do work for an organization, Native Seed Search, that is best known for its seed bank. But I'm the farm manager of their conservation farm. And so we grow out seeds, and we are attempting to grow out seeds in the context in which that is close to where those seeds were grown. The farm happens to be located in a place that shares qualities of both the high desert and the low desert. So we grow seeds representing 50 tribes in the Southwest, but very concentrated in southeastern Arizona and northwest Mexico. But from all over there, we have Pueblo seeds that we grow. But basically, on the farm, our attempt is to grow those under conditions that would resemble the conditions that a farmer in from any of those tribal geographic areas would be growing those seeds. And my approach is that farmers are plant breeders. Farmers have always selected seeds, have always bred for resistance, have always chosen those qualities in their field that they found desirable or necessary for all kinds of reasons. And I think the other important part of that is that we've gotten to a place with food across many cultures where food comes from no place in particular. And I feel that that's a detrimental thing, because food has always been associated through most of human history with family and community and a place. And I come from a very particular experience. My mother is from Syria. My grandparents were farmers in Syria when they emigrated to the United States from near Aleppo to Winooski, Vermont, a completely different environment. They brought their seeds with them. And they grew seeds that they knew, and they grew them for many years. And they shared them with other people, other gardeners in their community. And I have to say, I didn't know I was poor until I was well into my teens, because my food was always abundant and shared, and there were seeds, and you walked into my grandparents' pantry and there were jars of seed. And I came to northern New Mexico as a young graduate student in ethnobotany, and I saw the same things at Taos Pueblo, where I was working, and at Zia Pueblo, and then in the Hispanic villages, where there were seed varieties associated with a family. And often people would have a field, in the community where I lived in Dixon, but they would also have a field at a higher elevation and a field at a lower elevation, and often that was like a form of crop insurance. So it was not just about seeds and the genetics of that particular seed or the tradition of that particular variety. It was about exploiting, in a good way, different kinds of microclimates, and assuring that, because it was not just important to grow the crop for the food, it was important that you had a vital seed that could be resilient, that could adapt to growing conditions. And I think like having that experience as a very young child of the importance of seed, to not just to be able to supply food, but to be able to supply the food that we associated with family and community. And that people sharing seeds and growing food was a way for people to avoid hunger. And now we talk about food insecurity, but so few people grow food, let alone grow seeds. So in that way, I feel like the context in which seeds are grown is very important. The kind of growing conditions, the understanding of microclimates, the understanding of place is really important to the survival of seeds. And do I have 2 minutes?
You're fine.
The other important point I'd like to make is that the Native Seed Search Conservation Farm is very fortunate to work in collaboration, and we are joining farms to a group called Borderland Restoration, who are doing the conservation of wild seeds. And so we are having an opportunity to look at what people would have harvested from the wild in their own environment and the importance of those seeds. And we're just starting to do cooperative events where we sell seeds and plant starts of both wild plants and cultivars, to basically recognize that in most indigenous cultures, people also gathered plants that complemented the plants that they were growing, and that having this wild edge is important to the preservation of biodiversity, which is a key to the resiliency of our food system. And I know that with my own grandparents, for instance, they were amazing gardeners. There was everything from fruit trees to grapes in a garden less than 1 acre, and all kinds of vegetable crops, but always they gathered food from the wild and medicine from the wild and complemented. So I feel like that's another thing we're doing in Native Seed Search. We're trying to look at the wild biodiversity, the native plant biodiversity next to the cultivar biodiversity. So that's my story.
Thank you.
The New Mexico Food and Seed Sovereignty Alliance is a consortium between the Traditional Native American Farmers Association, which has members here in New Mexico and in Arizona, and the New Mexico Acequia Association. In 2006, we had our first small conference in a small town in northern New Mexico called Alcalde. And there in the community center, we had developed a declaration of seed sovereignty, a living document for New Mexico. And we unveiled it there at our conference, and I'm just going to read a few of the whereases, because listening to what you just said, here. Whereas our ability to grow food is the culmination of countless generations of sowing and harvesting seeds, and those seeds are the continuation of an unbroken line from our ancestors to us to our children and grandchildren. Whereas our ancestors developed a relationship with plants that allowed their cultivation for food and medicine, and this has been a central element of our culture and our survival for millennia in regions throughout the world. Whereas the concurrent development of cultures of Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas resulted in a plethora of food and crop types, including grains such as maize and wheat, legumes such as beans and lentils, fruits such as squash and chile, vegetables such as spinach and those of the cabbage family, and roots such as potatoes and turnips. Whereas these foods and crops, though developed independently of each other, came together in New Mexico with the meeting of the Spanish, Mexican, and Native American cultures to create a unique and diverse indigenous agricultural system and land-based culture. Whereas, just as our families are attached to our homes, our seeds learn to thrive in their place of cultivation by developing a relationship with the soil, water, agricultural practices, ceremonies, and prayers, thereby giving seeds a sacred place in our families and communities. Whereas the way in which seeds become attached to a place makes them native seeds, also known as land races. Also makes them an important element of the generational memory of our communities. Whereas the continued nurturing of native seeds or land races has provided the basis for the community coming together for communal work, such as cleaning acequias and preparing fields, as well as in ceremony, prayers, and in blessings, thereby binding our community's traditions and cultures together. Whereas the practice embodied in working the land and water and caring for seeds provides the basis for our respectful connection to the earth and with each other. There's 30 whereases in this declaration. We had probably 100 people that signed on this declaration there, from 5-year-old little farmers to 99-year-old farmers. This declaration has gone worldwide. We've taken this declaration to Tesuque Pueblo, where my community, the tribal council there, adopted this declaration via a resolution. We then took it to the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council, which is a consortium of 8 communities north of Santa Fe. They also endorsed this declaration via a resolution. Then we take it to the All Indian Pueblo Council, which is a consortium of all the 19 communities here in New Mexico, the Native American communities. They all passed it unanimously. From there, we took this declaration and our resolutions to the Santa Fe County Commission and the Rio Arriba County Commissioners. Both commissions passed their own resolution supporting our declaration. And then from there, we took it to the state legislature, and we were able to get a memorial pass. It was only a memorial, but biotech people came out there in force and tried to stop that little memorial. So ever since 2006, 2007, we've been going before the legislature trying to protect our seeds, trying to get GMOs out of our systems. But the problem is, New Mexico State University, which gets funding from big biotech companies, is our seed keeper. And they have a satellite farm in Alcalde. Now, I read the language that they're scared from Native American communities from being sued because we have all this language in place. Why don't they work with us? This declaration has gone before a conference, the convening of Indigenous Peoples for the Healing of Mother Earth, which was a meeting set up by the governments of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, the environmental departments. We took this declaration and we took language from this and put it into this declaration. And then we took the same declaration and we had another international meeting of Indigenous peoples on climate change there in Anchorage, which we also developed a declaration, and we took language based on the seeds and put it into this, into the Anchorage Declaration. after the Anchorage Declaration, some of my colleagues in the EPA national saw the relationships and the connections I have with indigenous peoples from around the world. And they were surprised because I'm just a homeboy from here, right? And they said, how can we get all your friends together? Would you like us to bring them to Indian country? I said, yes, let's please do that. And so we worked together. It took us about 3 years. We were able to get all our brothers and sisters from across the world into Oklahoma, Indian country. And we spent a week there. And then we went down to Dallas to the universities there, and we gave presentations, but we came up with a declaration called the Redstone Statement. And the title is Leave Us a Future. I took this declaration to the COP9, which is the Convention of Biodiversity, a United Nations event there in Bonn, Germany in '08. Language from that was placed into our indigenous statement before the body, protecting our seeds. And there they had all these youth, probably about 100 youth, and I can't remember the organization, but anyways, they performed in front, and they all were saying, leave us a future. And so that's what we titled this. And then from there, we took it before the National Congress of American Indians, which is a consortium of over 500 Native American communities here in the United States and Canada. And they passed a resolution which was a lot stronger than what we've passed within our area because they have language against genetic engineering. Okay? This was in '06, and in '10 or '11, the NCAI had a mini convention here in the city of Albuquerque, and they passed a supporting resolution to this. Last year from Tesuque Pueblo, we were able to get language at the national level protecting our seeds. I want zero tolerance. However, I'm still meeting, clashing because they want that 1% because they're not sure that they can say this is pure seed, this is non-GMO, non-contaminated seed, but that's what we want as our community. And so that's what our little community of Tesuque has accomplished.
Thank you, Louie. You've been working so hard through the years for the benefit of the farmers of northern New Mexico as well as throughout the country to protect a very vital aspect of all of our lives. And we all applaud you and appreciate your hard work. I also appreciate what Lynda and Scott have been doing in both locally as well as nationally and internationally in terms of preserving seeds in a variety of ways. The perspective I want to bring, I don't want you to think that seeds are frozen in time. That is not what any of us are saying. What we are saying is that through the generations, which is the title of the talk, that we can look at how seeds adapt to the world in which they are being grown and benefit directly the cultures that are doing the cultivation. If we take an example of what has been involved in every session so far at this conference, and that is Zea maize, we see that in northern New Mexico, the earliest maize we have up here dates to about 1200 BC. But it was a tiny little fella, It was about the size of your finger. It wasn't highly productive. It was being grown quite locally in a habitat where we would not be growing maize today, but it was a beginning. It was being grown not as a staple, as we think of it. It was grown for security. It was complementing what they were gathering from the environment, which was a variety of different kinds of plants, many of which have been mentioned at this conference. But this being used for security purposes, people were able to select it. Why? Because maize is dependent upon people for its survival and intergenerational perpetuation. So that its wild ancestor, which was mentioned yesterday, teosinte, spreads. It has, just like wheat in the old world, it has a brittle rachis, so that when the seeds mature, they scatter. And when I was involved in the great teosinte hunt that George Beadle, the geneticist, ran in Mexico, we'd walk through these large fields of teosinte, which before our search we did not know even existed in such a magnitude. And in those days, I had an afro. And I would walk through this teosinte, and then at the end of the day, I'd go like this, and I had probably half a pound of teosinte, which was fine because we were collecting it to use for genetic and other cultural purposes. But as this teosinte plant was being selected, the people knew that they weren't going to get much food if this thing could disperse so readily, just like wheat in the old world. So they selected for a non-brittle rachis, which began giving us the beginning of a cob. Tiny little things, but it was just seeds attached together that they could go ahead and use. This plant then begins our security search. They begin selecting against this. They begin selecting a whole series of traits. And this comes back to Scott and to Lynda. A lot of the traits that we don't think of as being that important today is what allowed maize to go from a tropical plant to New Mexico, because they selected against a day-length inhibitor. Teosinte was neutral in terms of day length. Up here, we know we're seeing the change of seasons now. You have a change in day length. And it grows with a long day length now. So it couldn't move very far until people selected against that quality, which they did. But they selected against other traits too. Like teosinte, when it scattered in the wild, it would only germinate if it was favored by so much soil moisture. Then it would leach out this inhibitor against its germination. As people were using it, they selected against that inhibitor so that they could both save the seed, plant the seed in the location that they wanted it, and move it in terms of the day length. Then they began getting other kinds of mutations. Instead of one rank, They selected for 2 ranks. So now we've doubled the number of kernels. And then we double that. And these were genetic mutations that the farmers recognized, because each of those mutations began to form a cob. And so that little package was more productive. It was 2, 3, 4 times more productive than the wild ancestor. So now all of a sudden, it's still small, but we have this little cob form. And it doesn't have a day length inhibitor. So by the time we get them about this big, we begin getting them in southern Arizona. And so by around 2000 BC, down there, they're beginning to get maize. We don't have it up here. Theirs was carried from Mexico, many people think, by people moving up this way. So it kind of shortchanged the length of time it would take. It comes up there, they begin to trade across borders. We've heard a lot about trade, starting with Lois Frank yesterday. They trade across the borders. We begin to get it coming up the Rio Grande Valley. We still have this small thing, but it's in a site at Jemez Springs called Jemez Cave. 1200 BC is the closest to northern New Mexico that we begin to get the maize. Still small. Within a couple of hundred years, though, these guys recognize, because they're farmers, what the potential of this was. It had a lot of the inhibitors removed. And this is what Scott was talking about. We now have a package that is very genetically plastic. And you can select for a lot of traits. What do they select for? Productivity. Because to be more secure, if you get more kernels, you're going to be more secure. So now they have a cob with 8 rows, and they're beginning to select things about this big. And then by the time we get to about 200 BC, we have a cob about like this. We have a name for it because it happened in many parts of Mexico, happened in southern Arizona. We get it here. We call it chapalote. And this thing begins to be selected for its productivity. And by this point, we're beginning to get a plant that can be used as a staple. But the story doesn't end there, because we come to what Louie's talking about. This plant may be more productive, but it doesn't mean it grows successfully in every habitat, nor has it been removed from the religious constraints. The religion of the Pueblo people at this point, they are now beginning to live in settled villages. They are recognizing the forked directions, although I think the hunters and gatherers did. But now we have colors associated with those directions. And they begin to select for corn with mutations of different colors. And we begin to have 4 different colors, and you've heard them already many times. Blue, yellow, red, white. And these have features that relate to our land races. So how do they protect them from interbreeding? It's just like Lynda said. You plant these colors in different locations. It's a form of security. It's a game against the environment. One year you might lose your white corn, but you're going to keep all the others. You can select against the successful ones that are adapted to your environment. By 1000 AD, what looks like corn today in terms of shape and what have you is in place. But there's still another mutation that comes into this. You can go with one mutation from splint corn to flour corn, and it can flip back and forth. And they would select for this for flour corn. Why? Your wife says, I can't grind that stuff. Get me something that I can grind. And so they begin grinding with flour corn. So that we get these changes over time. But it all makes sense when you realize, as somebody said today, corn is an artifact of human volition. It is an artifact that makes it dependent upon people, and it supports the survival of many people, not only in northern New Mexico, but around the world. That's it.
Well, let's give our panel a great hand.
When you talk about human volition, how organized was that? What did it look like? How conscious were those choices?
There are two answers to that, and they're intertwined. One is it was very deliberate when they saw one thing growing and growing successfully. But there is an unintended consequence as a result of human selection. You sometimes select for other traits that are beneficial, and you sometimes can select for traits that might not work. However, as has already been said, within a generation or two, you select against the ones that aren't working. You're not saving that seed.
May I add a comment?
Sure.
There is something happening contemporarily that needs to be kind of considered in all of what we're saying, and that is that now some of these crops are being grown for commercial, which is a lot different than what Richard is talking about. So in terms of human volition, I mean, we are consciously or not, crops that are now, some of these traditional crops that are being grown for commercial production are being grown under more industrial, sometimes industrial growing conditions. That will select. And I think that's something that just needs to be considered as we move into the future. And there have been discussions, important ones during this conference, that say, where are we going? Do we need to feed people first and then, have commercial production, or can we do both? And are those things mutually exclusive or compatible? Is a question that needs to be addressed, I think.
Yes.
At what point during the process from Kelsinte to ZMAs, do we have ZMAs?
Do we have what?
ZMAs.
We have ZMAs right from the beginning.
So
Teosinte, if you look at the DNA and the genes of Teosinte and ZMAs, they're identical.
Okay, so
You're adding mutations to the genome, but they are basically the same plant. It is the ancestor of maize, and genetically, it's the same. So from the beginning, from a genetic standpoint, we have the same plant. But does it look the same from a phenotypic standpoint? No. Those phenotypes change as a result of this selection that is both environmental and cultural over time.
Question for Louie. You mentioned that New Mexico State is both doing GMO-funded research and at the same time is the official laboratory for the hereditary seed stock, the landrace stock seeds. Are there any protections in mind to overcome that danger of the possible conflict of interest?
Stay away from them. We have Emilio Bayon back here, one of our farmers from home, helped develop a seed bank. I think the goal or the vision of the alliance is to have a seed bank within each watershed. And hopefully that will come to fruition with all the communities working together. New Mexico State, if you do not know, is trying to develop a chili picker. And so they're trying to develop a chili that's uniform in size for this machine to pick it up. So if you have something like this, it's not going to accept it. You come to northern New Mexico, any chili field, they're all different sizes and shapes. And the hottest ones are probably the smallest ones. Our brothers and sisters from Mexico, 50,000 workers a day cross the border to come pick chili. Now they're putting up a wall, they're developing a machine, so they're displacing a lot of good workers too.
But doesn't that eliminate different kinds of chili being grown? Because then it'll be like there's only one potato or something like tomato.
Well, right now there's also, if anybody will help me on this, they're trying to label the New Mexico chili, right?
Yeah.
New Mexico chili. Well, I'd rather call mine Tasuki chili, but they're telling me I can't, right? It has to be New Mexico chili. And so there again, we've got legislation coming down from big corporations stomping on small farmers.
Yeah, and one thing that has not been a danger in northern New Mexico up to now is like GMO contamination. The chili's grown in Hatch, and now there's, and most of the fields in northern New Mexico were pretty isolated. But inevitably, how you get that contamination, like with corn, even in very remote parts of Mexico, because of seed being sold or traded, or even food aid.
Or given free.
Or given free.
To the farmers.
Given free. Like, watch out for that, because basically then you have potential for contamination. And another thing people might not be aware of, like that organic certification may protect from GMOs, but Monsanto's already thought about that. So in the National Organic Program, genetic engineering is allowed. You can change a seed by irradiation, you can change a seed by some kind of manipulation that is not natural, is not a farmer selecting in their field. And that is the way there's more public outcry about GMO. Now Monsanto is putting new genetic engineering labs, and they've already got the national program putting their blessing on it. So now it won't be a protection for farmers any longer. And that's just the doorway into GMO, honestly. So I think this is a very, there's a lot going on under the surface, and it's going to take courageous acts of persistence, like these declarations, to really, protect our genetic, our food legacy.
If you go across the border in any direction, little third graders know what they're eating. They've got their little placards saying, "Save my food, save my seed, save my future." Here in the U.S., we don't, we're censored. Cheerios came out with a GMO-free cereal or something, but it's still chock full of sugars. So that's what we're up against.
I work for an organization that preserves native seeds. It is something that is a subject of a lot of discussion and concern within my organization. I personally, though, know through my own experience that the best way to preserve these seeds is in a cultural context, by farmers, for farmers. And I can't speak. It's a really complex thing. Like, the organization I work for does sell seed, but we're not a seed company. We have free seed programs to Native Americans, but really the way these seeds have always persisted is being saved by farmers, for farmers, and within a context of need, of purpose, and whether you want to call that, a spiritual purpose, a cultural purpose, an economic purpose, there's a need. And disconnecting the seeds from that need is not what's going to help them persist into the future. Because it's like it will take courage to do this. And it's an issue of cultural survival, it's an issue of human rights, basically.
I think I addressed that a little bit, is you can try to make the crop stand still cryogenically as one extreme, your storage techniques, but as Dick said, as all of us have said, these seeds are very plastic and everything you do changes them. And as Lynda just said, the best way to really preserve the seed is to preserve the culture, and that's the challenge in front of us. As a gardener, and I'm a gardener, you save the seeds. There are simple techniques of keeping them dry and keeping them cool, keeping them out of the sun that will extend their shelf life, and I think that's more to the point of what you are asking. But again, if you wait 8 years and you just plant the seed that the germination rate goes down and the seed that survives, you have inadvertently selected for long shelf life, and you may or may not have lost the qualities you were hoping to save. But there are simple techniques to lengthen the shelf life of a number of seeds. But the seeds don't stand still. They're, for better or for worse, they're amazingly plastic, and you do inadvertent things with them.